Hello and welcome to the Shakedown. Our mission is to inform people about how the criminal justice system works, the real people impacted by the justice system, and methods to improve justice through compassionate and casual conversation. Hosts of the Shakedown share over 50 years of combined personal experience dealing with Texas prisons and working to change the criminal justice system. And now, here's our show.
And that's the thing that the justice system has to constantly work against, is that you have the Eighth Amendment, which is assuring that you have a speedy trial, and that's part of why you have to, if they can't get out, if the judge can't hear your case in X amount of time, then that right is being lost. And it sounds like that's part of what's happening too, is that because they can't do that for one reason or another, they're just getting thrown out entirely.
Well, with COVID, we didn't try cases for a year or two, and now we're coming out of that, but we still were filing criminal cases. Not as many, but we're still filing criminal cases. So the backlogs after COVID were huge, and so trying to determine what cases and getting a system to get these cases done and resolved. I mean, we've got probably 20% fewer people in the prison systems because no cases were being tried. And so the state systems are probably 20% or more over what they normally have, because the people that would be, if they had their case tried, would be moved to the prison system, are still waiting trial. And a lot of those cases are getting dismissed because, we just have too much chaos going on.
Do you have any? Do you know what kind of crimes you're talking about? Like in the activity going on in San Francisco, like at the Nancy Pelosi building, where you're saying that they're being told not to come to work because it's so dangerous. What kind of crime is that? I mean, is it assault or robbery or what?
Well, the article that I read, it was I think a lot of it was drugs in that area. They've kind of stopped filing criminal cases on drugs, and so like Portland, and there's areas in San Francisco that just kind of are like an open opium den at the moment. We kind of have taken this position that we're going to help more people if we don't use the criminal justice system, but in effect, we're doing nothing. We're just allowing these people to overdose. We're setting record numbers of overdoses in these areas every month. And they've spent a lot of money on programs, but we're finding that less than 0.01% of these people are electing to go into programs because we're making it all voluntary. Under the system that works, you arrest them. You're arrested for these drug charges. You can either decide to go to rehab or you can go to prison. And that's the hammer that gets people to go to rehab. And you need that hammer because rehab has a 75% failure rate. And so they're going to have to go a couple of times.
There's the other part about it too, about with drugs, the areas where people are using drugs. That's been tried in a bunch of different countries, and the way they've had successful models and they've had failing models. And like you said, whenever they just decriminalize substances and let them go, it ends disastrously. Like I believe it was in Amsterdam, they had a whole park where it was like completely decriminalized, and then no one went to that park because basically everyone would go there, there'd be needles everywhere. Like they could not have families or anyone around in that area because that's what happened. And then I believe in Canada, what worked really well was that they had safe use spaces, but the spaces were monitored by people who actually were medical staff, and basically
they have safe injection sites in Canada.
Right. Yeah. And they basically they gave them clean syringes. They tested the drugs beforehand, and then they measured the doses so basically they could use with their supervision, and then if anything happened, they were right there next to a hospital and supervised with someone with emergency medical training, and there has been zero deaths or anything from them. And a lot of people who have gone to those sites, and I don't have the numbers on this, a lot of people have decided to stop using, even though it was legal for them to use in those spaces, and because it was not using like extremely heavy substances like meth or heroin or whatever. It reduces your life over time at the end of the day. So there's an end point, and then they self-administered themselves, but they didn't have like the crash of having to be in prison or fortunately or hurting someone else in the process. So that's one of the big advantages of having like a very highly monitored safe space. Whereas if you have the hammer, like, and I can speak from my own experience because I had I'm about to go to prison, so you gotta go to rehab. And with that experience, I listened. Like I was like, I'm going to listen now because I can't. I felt like I had no choice at that point. But I've seen lots of other people who they weren't ready to listen. Like their thing. I'll put it this way. My parents were telling, while I'm in treatment, they're like, you don't have a drinking problem. You have epilepsy. You had a seizure. You had a this. You had a that. And it's like, and that's exactly what most addicts need. All they need is an excuse, something to blame it on, something to push it off on, and they will. But they need, at some point, there will be no excuses.
I have a personal experience on this as well. I have a sister who had a car accident in 1989, the year I graduated from law school. I graduated in May, and in October, she had a car accident, and she broke every bone in her face. You could have stuck your finger through her mouth and out her eye socket. Wow. And she started a 30-year addiction to prescription medications. I mean, at one point, as a very young attorney, I tried to get her put in jail because that was the poor family's drug rehab. I mean, all the things you're talking about, we tried with her. All the get her into rehab, check right out. Met her second husband in rehab. They were arrested leaving a crack house. I mean, at the end of her life, her husband died having a heart attack. I had her declared incompetent. And the way we straightened her out was she was in an assisted living facility, and they had control of all of her medications, and they gave them to her as scheduled. And that was probably the first time in 20 or 30 years that she was probably doing the best she'd ever done. I mean, her family, other than me, wouldn't have anything to do with her at the end because they had so many years of trying to intervene and get her to go to treatment, and she would have very little spells of success and long spells of failure. And even probably within the last 2 years of her life, she was asking me to approve her getting a narcotic prescription, and I said no. And her reaction was to pull off all of her toenails. And so, look, this is something I have a pretty strong opinion about, getting people to go and getting treatment. I mean, I know they have to decide, but if you don't have a hammer, I mean, if we give up on drugs, we're giving up on crime because 80% of all crime some way gets traced back to drugs.
Yeah, I don't know if I can agree with that one, but I'm wondering how it is. I don't know. I'm wondering how it is that these people going into work were somehow unsafe because there's people doing drugs in the area.
No, I think it was more than that. I think car thefts as well. It wasn't safe for them to park their cars without them being broken into or stolen. And also walking into the building, they'd be assaulted by people as well. So,
and these are the crimes that were decriminalized, breaking into.
No, not decriminalized, but nobody was prosecuting them. We defunded the police, so they're short of police officers, they just don't have the manpower, and that's not a safe place to go anymore. So they finally said, y'all, the federal employees need to work from home and for the foreseeable future because it's not safe to go to work. I mean, come on, guys. You would think that we would all agree if it's not safe to go to work, crime's a problem, and yet we're still trying these untested, without research theories that and we're reaping the results of them.
Well, yeah, but some of it comes down to just what's fair. I mean,
Why?
the bail system, it affects the current system, hits poor people a whole lot harder than it does wealthy people.
I don't.
And I know
agree
people
with
that have
that.
been to jail and have lost everything for 2 weeks in jail for something that they didn't do. I mean, they lost because they're wage earners like me. I mean, they go to work and they live paycheck to paycheck. 2 weeks in jail, you get fired.
Look, if you look, there's a study that I highlighted on my podcast where it's talking about why people languish in jail, and the number one reason why people languish in jail is not because of poverty or their ability to pay for a bond. I mean, if you've got $1,000 bond and a bondsman will post it for $100 and get you out for $20 in a payment plan, there's not a problem setting a bond. The number one reason why people languish in jail is because of their criminal history. And once you're in jail, when you have a criminal history and you're in jail because your bond is set higher, then it's not because you're poor, it's because you have a criminal history, because you're a risk to public safety. And why is that an issue of fairness? Doesn't the public have a right to safety?
Because what you're saying by saying that someone is a risk to public safety is punishing someone for potentially committing a crime that hasn't happened yet.
No, that's one of the assurances that you have to give to the court to be let free, is that you will not commit a new crime and that you will return to answer the charges. That's what our society is based upon.
The person I just told you about that just got out of jail a couple of months ago didn't commit any crime to begin with. That's why he was eventually let go after spending 2 months in jail.
Well, but isn't that part of the problem? We're going to have even less faith in the criminal justice system because of all the chaos that's being created. They can't triage the cases to determine which ones they need to go forward with and which ones they just are valid dismissal. They're dismissing in mass.
I agree with your basic assertion that we're safer as a society. There'll be less crime, I guess you can say, if you lock more people up. But then again, you see that in societies like Iran and things like that, where they have very draconian rules where they prosecute crimes with cutting off hands and things like that. Yeah, they almost have a non-existent crime rate. So yeah, being harsher on people.
Is that a true comparison here? I mean, we have a lot of people in jail because every country in the world sends their drugs to the United States. So we have all the drugs coming here. So of course we're going to have a higher percentage of people in prison than most people. I mean,
they've got just as many drugs in other countries as they do here. They just don't prosecute them the same way.
So really, I mean, if you're talking about the drugs and they send all the drugs here, so isn't it a matter of education? Because nobody's forcing anybody to do drugs. They're doing them because they want to do them. So educate them.
That's part of the problem in our urban areas. Our schools have failed. I mean, there was a study recently from some privileged school in some urban area, and every student in the school was below grade level on reading and math. And so I think schools have failed. We're seeing it every day where we're not teaching reading, writing, arithmetic. We're teaching that we should be using proper pronouns. We should be reacting a certain way to social experiments. So I think we have problems with that. We have problems with drugs in our urban cities. We have problem with families. I did a podcast with the sheriff of Tarrant County, and he said 80% of the population in his jail share three things. The first one is no father in their life. Number two, no education. And number three, some outside influence, whether it's gangs or mental health. Mental health is an issue we haven't even talked about.
No, I was going there.
Why is the Harris County Jail the largest mental health facility in the state of Texas?
I can agree with you on that one too.
But what's the alternative? I mean, this was not a new. This was not a controversial theory when it came out, but the broken windows theory, and also if you cannot change course and become a productive member or a non-crime committee person in society, we will lock you up, and that's how we will provide public safety. I mean, if you think about it, just take a step back. We are committing the same mistakes we did in the 60s. In the 60s, we felt safe, and so we were more forgiving on crime. We let more people out of jail, out of prisons. Crime started going up. And so then we started fighting amongst ourselves about how to address it. We had one side of the spectrum that wouldn't agree to do anything. And so we ended up having a backlash. We had Reagan. We had tough on crime. Even Clinton was tough on crime for a while. And now we're back to where we were in the 60s, or we were 5 years ago. We felt safe. And so we started being more forgiving on crime, and we're having the same cycle take place once again.
Yeah. Well, as someone who was actually locked up during that period of time of the tough on crime thing and spent 30 years in prison because of it, that's why I have the problems that I do. Is because I've seen what happens whenever you get real draconian and you don't care and you decide that
Okay,
it's more
so as someone who was in jail for 30 years, what's the alternative?
See, I knew that's where I thought you were going to go to, the alternative. And I understand. Look, what you're going to say is absolutely correct. What you have going now is the better solution compared to any alternative I'm going to give you, because it's you already have the jails, you already have the police, you already have all these things. They have a momentum that's going that I can't possibly beat by any kind of scheme I can come up with right now.
Okay,
I can come up with some ideas that are probing in the right direction, but ultimately, I just don't believe that it's right.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, what was the reason why you were in jail for 30 years?
I went to prison for murder when I was a 17-year-old kid. But
Okay.
Here we're going to go into this. I went to jail at a time whenever they had this hysteria about teenagers and crime and all this type of thing. And so they labeled my crime as some kind of skinhead gang initiation murder, and whenever it had nothing to do with this whatsoever. I was almost given the death penalty behind this. They were trying to.
Well, okay, so
it was all because of some Princeton professor that came out with this super predator theory and was telling everybody.
Let's compare that to now, okay? Houston, Texas, right now for the last several years. In Texas, if you were accused of murder, you didn't get out of jail. You were going to be in jail up until the time of trial, usually. But in Houston, with all these reforms and saying we need to be more fair, I mean, it was like you got one free murder before you would be held. And so people were being arrested for murder, released, and some of them on personal bonds, but then they were being held after they committed a second murder. And that's when people started getting very angry. It's like, the dog bite, you get one free dog bite. The murder thing is a very serious crime, no matter what your age. I mean, it's serious. And what are the consequences?
Right. It's a serious crime, and I'm not trying to say that people shouldn't be punished for their crimes, but I am trying to say that before you've been convicted of a crime, you're not. I don't understand why you're treating them like they've committed a crime.
Well, it goes back to what assurance, and like in Texas, we have the Texas Constitution that says there are certain crimes that we consider as a society to be so serious that the court has the authority to detain you, even though you haven't been found guilty. Because, guilt or innocence has nothing to do with pretrial release. It's all about what assurance you're going to give the court that you're going to come back.
So you're unfairly giving all. I mean, it just goes the disadvantages that go along with this.
Absolutely,
when I was 17 years old. Already just being 17 years old, you know nothing about the law. You have no money whatsoever. You are a sitting duck for whatever the heck they want to do to you. And then you couple that with the fact that you can't get out of jail because they've posted this high bond and you don't have any money to begin with. I mean, you can't even fight your case because your case is being fought in the media. Your case is being fought and the cops are doing their investigation and talking to all the witnesses and everything else.
So what could we have changed about your process? What could we have changed
about my process?
Yeah.
Well, where do you even start? You can start with what we're talking about. First and foremost, it would have been fair if I would have been released on a PR bond, or at least given a fair amount of a sum of money that I could have afforded somehow. I don't know how what you would come up with. Something that you could, some kind of agreement
Sure.
by my family or something that would have gotten me out of prison so that I
But
could have.
the
Let
thing,
me okay, wait,
Okay.
before we move on, let me
yeah,
just apply what we're seeing on bail reform through litigation and apply that to your situation. So, in the bail reform litigation, the argument was part of what you're saying. Hey, you can't hold anybody if they say they can't afford that bond. And the arguments were you have a right to release. Now, most of that litigation was on misdemeanors, but there were some on felonies as well. And so there's this whole fight over do you have a right to release or do you have a right to a hearing? And what the courts ultimately held was if you can't afford the bond that's set, you have a right to a hearing asking for a deviation to go down for a lower bond. And the courts have held now, we've had the 11th Circuit and the 5th Circuit hold that that's all you have a right to. You have a right to a hearing asking for a lower bond. The Constitution does not require your release. So even though that was 30 years ago, the law is still the same today. You don't have a right to release. You
I'm
have a
not
right to
arguing with
request a
I'm not
lower bond.
arguing with the Constitution or what the law has to say about this. I'm arguing whether or not that's right or wrong. And I know that the first thing that we want to jump to is, well, they have the right. They have the law says that they can do this to you. So since the law says they can, that means that it's okay for them to do it. But I mean, I don't see how it's right for them to be able to take someone who is a much more mature individual who knows a whole lot more about the law and has money and all that, and let them go and give them a fair chance of being able to defend themselves in a case, and not do that for a teenager.
Did you have your own attorney? Did you have a public
I have a public attorney, yes.
okay, so you were provided with a public attorney at the public's expense.
Yes.
So you had representation. Did you think they do a good job?
No.
Nope.
I mean, it's kind of hard to say. They were very nice to me, and at the time, I don't know it. Like I said, I didn't know anything about the law, so it's hard to say if they did a good job or if they did a bad job.
Well,
I mean,
okay, so
ultimately, I
I'm
think
going to
they did
ask
a
the
pretty.
toughest question. So the toughest question is the jury found you guilty. Was that right or was that wrong?
It was right for them to find me guilty. I was guilty of murder, but I wasn't guilty of murder under the circumstances they said I was.
Okay, so you were found guilty of murder and you were assigned a punishment. And that goes, I mean, once you get to that point, I mean, I'm not even here talking about uh, criminal justice reform for prisons. I don't really haven't looked at that issue. I'm talking about just pretrial release. But
That's
let
what
me
I'm
say
talking about.
this: I am all on board with reform. You become if you hey, I can be a productive citizen, and you get your education through prison, and whatever you want to do. We find Jesus. A lot of people make jokes about it, but you turn and say, hey, I want to be a protective citizen. I'm all about showing mercy for that. The problem with that we have is our government. It's very difficult for them to do that. We had the Federal First Step Act that was passed by Trump, and I had somebody from DC on my podcast talking about it. And he said, "Look, Ken, the government can't do individual assessments of people to determine whether they are going to be productive citizens. They can do across the board release." And anything else is too expensive for the government. So the reason why the First Step Act had across the board release for certain people who met certain criteria, that's all the government is good at, and that's why I'm critical of those types of things because there's going to be too many mistakes. But I'm always in favor of individual assessment and determination. And if we think that, hey, you've changed, you have the skills to be successful now, I'm all for that. It's just we don't have a very
I
good system for
agree
evaluating it.
with what you're
I, I,
saying.
I can agree with what you're saying there too. And for the most part, like I said,
Right
I
here.
mean, I know I'm kind of contentious with you and all that, but for the most
No,
part, I think what you're saying is true. I mean, I don't really argue your numbers or any of that. I just some of
no,
whether
no,
or
no. I
not.
mean, look, we're not contentious at all. How can we be contentious when you're telling me you agree with me most of the time?
There
I
you go.
what
It's just the points of disagreement right there.
Sure.
Every once in a while, they kind of flare up.
I- and I agree with what you're saying about that you need to have people assess it. I think that is actually a vital piece that we don't have currently. We have too many that, like you said, they can't. if there was going to be any change right now, like a massive change, it's going to be blanket. And then when you do a blanket change, just like you're talking about with decriminalization, then it doesn't work. Or a good example is like what you're talking about in DC. They, in 2020, they defunded their police department by $15 million. And now they're having issues because of it. Because unfortunately, the catchphrase got stuck in the head, like the defund the police got in. But the other half of that, which is what do you do with $15 million when you take it away from somewhere? It's got to go someplace else to people who actually know, who can deal
Yeah,
with.
but one of the arguments was we're not going to send police anymore. We're going to send caseworkers. And do you know how many times you can do that before the city has, so much liability exposure? Who's triaging those cases to decide, oh, well, this is really just someone who needs a caseworker, so we're going to send a caseworker. They end up getting shot and killed, then the county's going to be sued for that. And also I would say would have gross negligence for doing that. And so you end up sending a policeman and a caseworker, which would be double the expense if you do it.
Right, and that's a lot of places. That's what they've done. They've
a lot of places talked about it, and then they couldn't increase the money, and so they ended up with fewer people working for them and no caseworkers.
Right, but this is that. It ends up being the question of how, like, so at that first spot, how are we triaging? Like, can we triage it to that every 911 call going to a police officer? Can we send it to someone else? Are we ready to do that? Like, can we break it down that way? Or does everything have to, like, do we have to have, like, here we have core teams in Longmont, or a core team, which is police officer, social worker, like addiction specialist, like, and they have like a whole team that goes out, but it's one team and they're overbooked constantly. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the question that never got answered. And like I said, it's hard, like, can you do that? But like, you might be able to actually do that if you set that up as the default of sending a team, but you're going to have to change the way it's your police, because now you're taking away money from like raids and things like that, like bigger aspects that where a lot of the budget goes towards.
I would argue that we are trying to make our criminal justice system into something that it was never intended to be. We've already failed schools, we've already failed families, and now we're saying, oh yeah, we can fix all that right here in the criminal justice system. We just need to figure out what's missing in their lives, and we just need to figure out what we can do. You've already screwed all that up for their whole lifetime until they're in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system was made to arrest somebody, find out if they committed the crime, and then just impose the least amount of pressure to get you to become productive again as needed. And then if you came back, more pressure. And if you came back, more pressure. But that's not what it is anymore. No, it's broken. It's completely broken, and it's broken because of chaos in our urban areas where we're trying all these reforms that do not work, and we have all this rhetoric that doesn't do anything but just shut down debate. And you have to treat everybody the same. We talk about fairness, and if you don't, well, then you're racist. And so how can we have a triage that's truly a triage if we're not treating everybody the same? Because then we're racist, when that's the whole point of the criminal justice system, is only to impose the least amount of pressure to get you to be productive again. And so what's good for you may not be the same amount of pressure that I need. And then the problem is we have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by certain racial groups. 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young black males. And who do you think are doing the murdering? Young black males. And somehow in our society, we've decided to favor the murderer over the victim right now. And that has got to change.
It gets into the, like, before, when you were talking about looking at the crime rates over time, and then like, as we got more comfortable, we want to, like, first in the 90s, we had a bunch of crime, and we're like, no, please. We have a Democratic president. We're going to sign more laws saying let's get police going. Let's get harsher sentences and mandatory
We're going to arrest
minimums.
more. We're going to hire more
Right.
police officers with federal money.
Right. But whereas in the 60s and stuff, we're comfortable, it's safer, so let's not do that. I tend to think that that's not the reason that that it was going that way, because it's more of there's systemic issues that were there, and and I also agree, like, the criminal justice system is really, the way it's set up, it's doing what it was meant to do. And the question is well, if that's not keeping us safe and lowering crime and making sure that people have fair trials, if that's not doing any of that, then what's the point of having it?
You can find Shakedown merch, graphic novels, and other projects at waywordpress.com. That's WAYWORD press.com. If you would like to support The Shakedown, get exclusive content, and watch episodes live, you can support us at patreon.com/The Shakedown. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment to give Malone that inner peace he so richly deserves.